In this video, you are going to master 20 variations in the Nimzo-Indian Defense with the black pieces. So let's start. So we are playing with the black pieces and white starts the game with 1d4. We play knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3. And from here, the Nimzo-Indian begin. After knight c3, here black is having two options to continue the game. Black can play the move d5, which is also known as the queen's gambit decline, or black can play the move bishop b4, which we are going to discuss, also known as the Nimzo-Indian, one of the most longest theoretical line. So bishop b4. After bishop b4, white is having already many options to continue the game. White can play queen c2, e3, knight f3, f3, a3, queen to b3. So there are already tons of options for white to continue the game. First, let's try to discuss what happens if white goes for playing the move queen to b3. After queen b3, white is simply attacking the bishop. So we play the move c5, defending the bishop. And after white captures the pawn on c5, here white have already lost his center control. So we are going to play the move knight to c6 in this position, simply protecting the bishop. After knight c6, we have knight f3, and after knight f3, we are already having a very strong move in the position, which is to play the move knight to e4, attacking the knight on c3. And the idea is to simply capture the knight and give white a bad pawn structure. So white is forced to play the move bishop to d2, where we can simply grab the bishop, and now we are the only one having the bishop pair. Here we are simply going to short castle, e3, bishop into c5, knight e4, attacking the bishop. We pull back with the bishop, long castle, and already a6, knight d6, and b5, sacrificing the pawn, cb5, ab5, knight bishop b5. And here you can already continue the game via queen c7, where you are a pawn down, but you are having a tremendous attack on the white king, and the position is already better for black. So going back, this is exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move queen to b3. Now let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays e3. A very direct move, attacking the bishop. Here you can simply capture the knight, because after pawn takes, white is having a bad pawn structure. So after b into c3, now I must recommend you guys to play the move c5. What's the idea? After c5, we are fixing the pawns on the c3 and c4. And if white tries to capture the c5 pawn, now white is having three isolated pawns which are extremely weak, and black is already way better than you can imagine. So going back, white must play a move like f3. Idea is pretty simple. White wants to play the move e4 and establish a strong center. After f3, we play the move knight c6, develop the knight, e4, and here we play the move d6, simply protecting the c5 pawn. And after bishop e3, we play the move b6. What's the idea? After bishop e3, white's idea is to simply capture the c5 pawn. That's the reason we play the move b6, defending the pawn on c5. After b6, white simply continues with bishop d3, and here we can already play a move like knight to a5, attacking the pawn on c4. Remember guys, you must not play the move like bishop a6 in this position, because here white's having queen a4, attacking the knight and the bishop, where you must play a move like queen c8 or bishop b7, which is a bad move. That's the reason you first must play the move knight a5, and then after knight s3, you can play this move e5, a very interesting move. What's the idea? Your idea is to simply capture the knight. So the knight is forced to move, and now you can play the move bishop a6, putting pressure on the pawn on c4. Here, white simply castle, and here we can already play a move like knight g7. The idea is pretty simple. We cannot capture the pawn in this position, because after bishop takes, knight takes, white can play queen a4, check, and we lose the piece. So that's the reason we first play the move knight d7. Now what's the idea of knight d7? In this position, we like to castle, but the problem here is white can play bishop g5, pinning up the knight, followed by f4. That's the reason we do not want our knight to f6. So we play the move knight d7, and after queen a4, defending the pawn on c4, we play the move c into d4 first. And after c into d4, we simply castle. Now what's the idea of capturing on d4 in the position? Because now we have an open c file, putting more pressure on the c4 pawn, and black is already having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move a3. Now going back, what happens if your opponent plays the move f3? What's the idea? The idea is to play the move e4 and establish a strong center. After f3, we play the move c5, going for simply attacking the center. After c5, white must play d5 to have a good control in the center. And after d5, we already play a move like b5, a very interesting move. After b5, what's the idea? If white tries to simply capture the pawn, we can already capture the d5 pawn with the knight, because the knight on c3 is simply pinned, so we are already having a better position. Going back, so white plays a move like e4. The idea is to simply defend the pawn on c4, and also having a nice center, the idea is also to play the move e5. So we play the move d6. The idea is to simply stop the move e5. And after d6, knight to e2, which is the main move for white to develop his pieces. Now we can already simply capture the pawn on c4. White plays knight f4, which allows us to play the move e5, attacking the knight, kicking the knight back, and here we are having knight d7 followed by knight b6, defending the pawn on c4. So after knight b6, white must play bishop e2. The idea is pretty simple. White wants to do a short castle. After bishop e2, you will realize that you have already successfully kind of developed all your pieces. So after bishop e2, the point here is if you try to simply short castle in this position, white can play bishop g5, short castle, and f4 in the position, trying to put pressure on the f6 knight. So at the place of castling, we first play the move knight to g8, which is a very interesting idea. After knight g8, white plays queen c2, we play knight to e7, and after short castle, now only we castle. What's the main difference? In this position, if white plays bishop g5, we are already having the move f6, and it's a better position for black. And in this position, after short castle, white plays a4. The idea is very simple. White wants to play the move a5. So at the place of playing a5, we play the move bishop to a5. And after bishop a5, knight b5, we can already play a move like knight g6. What's the idea? After knight g6, our idea could be to play the move simply knight f4, grabbing more space on the king side. And after bishop takes, pawn takes, the knight is attacked, and we are also having the bishop pair advantage. So black is already having a pretty fine position. So this is exactly how you must play if your opponent plays f3. So going back, what happens if your opponent plays knight to f3 in the position, which looks kind of natural, simply focusing on developing the pieces. After knight f3, we keep the maximum flexibility by simply short castling in the position, and after short castle, white plays bishop g5, which looks pretty natural, pinning up the knight. And after bishop g5, here we play the move c5. After c5, the idea is pretty clear, we are putting more pressure in the center. And after c5, white plays e3. A pretty basic chess, a fundamental chess. After e3, we simply capture the pawn on d4. And after e into d4, we play the move d5 in the position, already striking in the center. After d5, white plays rook c1. After d5, if your opponent plays a move like c5, you can already play a move like b6. And after takes, bishop into c3, pawn into c3, a into b6, you are having the open a file, the c3 pawn is weak, and black is already way better than you can imagine. So going back, c5 is already a bad move. Rook c1 is the main move, defending the knight on c3. And here, you must first play h6, asking the bishop, hitting the bishop, and also making a square for the king to run away in the future. Bishop h4, and here simply knight to c6, focusing on developing the pieces. And after e3, now the point here is, if you try to capture the knight with the bishop, here white will simply capture the bishop with the rook. So first, we must play bishop e7, because capturing the knight doesn't make any sense, because white will simply capture the bishop with the rook. After bishop e7, white plays c5, and here black can already play a move like knight e4, establishing the knight in the center. And after bishop e7, queen e7, bishop b5. For example, after queen into e7, if white tries to capture here, pawn takes, rook d8 is coming up, and black is already having a very fine advantage. So that's the reason bishop b5 is the main move, and here we can already simply capture this knight on c3, rook c3, and simply playing the move e5. The idea is pretty simple. We want to capture the d4 pawn, giving a check and also hitting the rook. So white simply short castle, and here we simply pin the knight on f3. And after bishop g4, bishop into knight, pawn into, our idea is to simply push the pawn. So white must capture the pawn in the position. So we simply capture the knight, rook takes, queen takes pawn, and we have an equal position. Our c6 pawn is a bit weak, but it compensates because we are having already a strong pawn on d5, and we can already play a move like rook b8, a5, and black is having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight to f3. So now let's try to discuss what happens if white plays e3. After e3, we play the move short castle, and here white is having already tons of options to continue the position. White can play bishop to d3, knight to e2, a3, knight to f3, and bishop to d2. There are tons of options. So first, let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays bishop to d3. First, developing the bishop. After bishop d3, you can already play the move d5. Now what's the idea of playing the move d5? After d5, you want to simply capture the pawn on c4. So after d5, white is again having three options. If white plays knight f3, you can simply capture the pawn on c4, bishop c4, and you can play the move c5, simply attacking the center. Short castle, you can capture the pawn on d4, pawn into, and you can simply play the move b6, having a pretty fine position. And after b6, if bishop g5, you can play the move h6, attacking the bishop, bishop g4, and bishop b7. And after bishop b7, white is again having four critical options to continue the possession. If white plays queen e3, the idea is to simply centralize the queens and having the idea of rook d1, rook e1. After queen e3, we can play the move knight d7, defending the knight on f6. And after rook d1, we can play bishop into knight. What's the idea? If queen captures the bishop, here already rook c8 is extremely strong, followed by b5. So queen into bishop is not possible. So white is forced to capture the bishop with the pawn, and here already a6. The idea is to simply play the move b5. And here white must play a4, and here we can already play queen c7, followed by rook c8, rook d8, and black is already way better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays queen to d3. If white plays rook to e1 in the position, simply developing the rook, we can play knight to c6 this time. And after a3, simply pull back with the bishop, protecting the knight. And here after queen d3, rook c8, simply developing the pieces, rook d1, knight to h5, a very interesting idea, forcing a bishop trade. And followed by after bishop takes, after bishop takes, queen takes, knight f4, queen f6, rook d8, black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays rook e1. So if your opponent plays queen to e2 in the position, keeping a bit flexibility, defending the bishop and putting the queen on the e5. After queen e2, we play the move knight d7. Stays the same idea of defending the knight on f6. Here after rook c1, we play the move rook c8, developing the pieces, rook d1, and here we simply capture the knight. Pawn takes. If you try to capture the bishop with the rook, it's already a bad idea because white is having a isolated pawn on d4. So white must capture with the pawn, and here we can already play the move like queen c7, attacking the bishop, and here white plays knight to d2, defending the bishop. And after knight d2, we can already play a move like queen to f4, attacking the bishop, bishop g3, and already queen to g5. And after queen g5, once again black is having no weaknesses, where black can simply play the move h5, h4, maybe rook d8, and black is completely better. Black is having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what you can do if your opponent plays queen to e2. If your opponent plays knight to e5 in the position, centralizing the knight, and after knight e5, you can simply play the move knight to d7. The point is, after knight into f7, you can simply capture the knight with the rook, bishop takes, and queen to f8. And after queen f8, you are simply defending the rook, and after queen b3, you can simply capture the knight, takes, rook e8, bishop c4. You can repeat the position if you want, or else after bishop to e6, you can already play rook to c6. And the position is extremely fine. If bishop into rook, takes, you are having two minor pieces for a rook, and black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight to e5. And after knight e5, knight d7, if your opponent captures the knight on d7, you can simply capture the knight. And the point is after bishop f6, gf6, indeed your king is a bit weak, but you are having the bishop pair, and at the same time you are having the ideas of king h8, rook g8, putting pressure on the king. So that's the reason black is already better in the position. So that going back, that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop g5. Now let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays e3. After e3, you can already capture the knight, pawn takes, and queen to c7, attacking the bishop and the pawn. The bishop fall back, we capture the pawn, bishop to g5, focusing on developing the pieces. We can play knight d7, defending the knight, rook c1, queen f5. What's the idea? After queen f5, our idea could be to play the move bishop a6, forcing a bishop trade. So a4 first, and here after queen to d5, black is already better in the position because there is no way white can ever attack the queen. The idea could be to play bishop b7, rook c8, and black is having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays knight to f3. So if your opponent plays c into d5 in the position, you can already capture the pawn with the pawn, knight to e2, and you can simply fall back with the bishop. What's the idea? The bishop is simply perfectly placed on the d6 square. After short castle, you can play rook e8, bishop d2, and you can finally play the move b6. What's the idea? After b6, Now the f3 or rook c1 can simply be met with the strong move c5. And after b6, rook c1, you can play the move c5 already. Pawn takes, knight to f4. The idea is to put more pressure on the pawn on d5, but here you can simply capture the knight, pawn takes. And here it looks like white's having the bishop pair, but you can already play the move bishop a6, forcing a bishop trade. And now you are having the central pawns, which are extremely strong, and you are having a very comfortable position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent captures the pawn. If your opponent plays a move like a3 in the position, attacking the bishop, you first capture the knight, pawn takes, pawn checks pawn, bishop takes, and you play the move c5. And after knight f3, focusing on developing the pieces, queen to c7, queen d3, and already b6. What's the idea? You want to develop your bishop to b7. So after short castle, bishop b7, knight to e5, you can already play a move like bishop to d5, forcing one pair of bishop trade. And after you trade one pair of the bishops, the position is dead equal, and black is already very comfortable. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop to d3. Going back, what happens if your opponent plays knight to e2? After knight e2, the idea is pretty simple. Now white wants to play a3, and if you try to capture the knight, now whites will simply capture the bishop with the knight. So that's the reason we first play a very interesting move, c6, making a square for the bishop to go on c7. So after a3, bishop a5, b4, you play the move bishop to c7. And after bishop c7, white plays e4. The idea is pretty simple. White wants to play e5, establishing a full center control. So we play the move d5, striking in the center. And after e5, you simply fall back with the knight. And after knight f4, it looks like white is having way more space and white should be better. But you are having a very strong move, a5. Already trying to play on the queen side of the board. The idea is to simply capture the pawn, because after pawn takes, rook is simply hanging. So after rook b1, you can already capture the pawn, pawn takes, and here black is having a very strong move, which is to play the move c5. And after c5, if white captures the pawn with the d pawn, the e5 pawn is hanging, so white must capture the c5 pawn with the b pawn. And here, after bishop a5, attacking the knight, white must play bishop d2, but here simply pawn takes, bishop takes, and here black is having a very interesting move, which is to play the move knight into e5, capturing the pawn, attacking the bishop. Where after pawn takes, here you can already play the move queen d4, getting at least a piece. So the position is roundabout even, and it's already hard for white to find a move. That's exactly what you can play if your opponent plays knight to e2. If your opponent plays e3 in the position, attacking the bishop, you can already capture the knight, pawn takes, and play the move knight to c6. You have not yet played the move d5, keeping the maximum flexibility. And after bishop d3, you can play the move e5, already striking in the center. And after knight e2, you can already play e4, attacking the bishop, kicking the bishop back, and play the move b6. What's the idea? You want to play bishop a6 and put pressure on the pawn on c4. So after knight g3, attacking the pawn on e4, you can play the move bishop a6, f3, takes, and play the move d6, stopping white's e5. And after king f2, it's a very thematic theme because white can no longer castle, so king f2, knight to a5, so basically locking the bishop and the queen for protecting the b3 square. And after knight a5, rook d1, you can play the move rook e8, putting more pressure on the pawn on e4. And after king g1, g6, covering the f5 square and the h5 square from the knight, and black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays a3. Now going back, what happens if your opponent plays knight to f3? Simply focusing on developing the pieces. After knight f3, you can play the move d5, and after a3, bishop takes, pawn takes, and already c5, pushing the d and the c pawn. And after bishop b2, the idea is pretty simple. After knight c6, rook c1, knight a5, takes. Here, white will simply capture the pawn on c5. Why? Because after d into c5, white wants to play the move c4. So you must try to stop the move c4 by playing the move bishop e6, covering the c4 square. And here after knight d4, you can play the move knight to e4, attacking the pawn on c5. So after c4, you can already capture the pawn with the knight. Bishop takes, and here you are already having a very strong move, which is to play the move queen to a5, check. And the point here is, white is forced to play the move bishop c3, where after knight takes, you must play queen d2, and after d c4, it's an even position. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays the move knight to 3. So now let's try to discuss what happens if your opponent plays the move bishop to d2. The idea is to simply defend the knight with the bishop. Here we play the move d5, knight f3, and we play the move b6. Our idea is to develop the bishop to b7. And after b6, we have cd, ed, and here we have rook c1. After rook c1, we play the move bishop to b7, focusing on developing the pieces, bishop d3, and play the move bishop e7. Now, usually the best square for the bishop is to return on d6. But after bishop d6, white is having the move knight to b5. That's the reason we first playing bishop e7. And after short castle, we can play the move c5 now. And after knight e5, knight to c6, bishop to e1. What's the idea? White's idea is to play the move f4 followed by bishop to h4. So here we play the move bishop d6. And once white plays f4, we can already capture the pawn on d4. What's the point? If white captures the pawn back, we can already play the move knight b4, bishop takes pawn, knight h7, takes, and here we have bishop c5, and the queen is dead. So going back, after c into d4, white is forced to capture the knight in this position. After bishop takes, pawn takes, we can play the move queen d7, and we are having the bishop pair, and we can already put our knight to e4, and black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays e3. So now going back and coming to the main move, what happens if your opponent plays the move queen to c2? After queen to c2, you can play the move short castle, and after short castle, white's again having 4 critical moves to continue the position, which is bishop to f4, e4, knight to f3, and to play the move e3. If your opponent plays bishop f4, you can play the move d5, establishing a strong center, pawn takes, and you capture with the knight, attacking the bishop and the knight. So the bishop is forced to go back with the bishop, and here you can already play the move c5, just attacking the center. And after pawn takes, bishop takes pawn, and black is already better in this position because black has successfully castled, his pieces are developed, knight c6 is coming up, b6, bishop b7, and black is already equalized. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays bishop f4. If your opponent plays e4 in this position, you can play d5, attacking the center, e5, and here knight to e4. The knight cannot capture the knight because the knight is pinned up. So bishop d3, and here you can play the move c5. After c5, your idea is to simply capture the d4 pawn. So white is much protected via knight e2, and here you can still capture the d4 pawn. Knight takes followed by knight to d7, putting pressure on the pawn on e5. And here, if white tries to capture the knight, after pawn takes, queen takes in this position, you can already play the move like f5 in this position, which is very interesting, attacking the pawn. And if white tries to end pass in this position, you can already capture with the knight. And black is having just too many compensation for the pawn, and black is already better in this position. So that's the reason white must play a move like bishop f4. First, protecting the pawn on e5, and here you can play the move queen h4, attacking the bishop where g3 is compulsory, queen h5, h4, and here you can simply capture the e5 pawn. And after bishop e2, it looks like the queen has to move and the knight can be easily captured. But now you can play the move queen g6, where after bishop takes f6, attacking the bishop, it doesn't matter where the bishop goes. If bishop to c7, you can play the move knight c3, and it's a fine position because after pawn takes, queen takes, knight takes, bishop takes pawn, you can win the rook. And if bishop f4, you can play the move e5. So that's the reason h5 is the main move, and after queen f7, you can simply get a piece back and the position is even. So that's exactly what happens if your opponent plays e4. If your opponent plays knight to f3, simply developing the pieces, you can play the move d5, bishop to g5, and you can play the move c5, again simply striking in the center. dc5, and here, the point here is, as the knight is on f3, white can never play the move f3. So in this position, after dc5, you can play the move first h6, kicking the bishop back, and play the move knight to a6. The idea is to simply capture the pawn on c5 followed by knight to e4 in the future. And after knight a6, a3, you can capture the knight, queen takes, and you can first play the move g5, attacking the bishop, kicking the bishop back, and play the move knight e4, kicking the queen and give a check now. After queen f5 check, the knight is forced to go on d2, and you can already play the move bishop to d7. The idea is to play the move bishop a4, and black is already better. So that's exactly how you can continue the game if your opponent plays knight to f3. If your opponent plays a3, which is the main move, you can simply capture the knight, queen takes, and you can play the move d5. And after d5, if bishop g5, you can play the move c5, dc5, and you can play the move d4 in this position, attacking the queen. And if queen to f3 attacking the knight, you can first play knight d7. e3, you can play the move h6 first, attacking the bishop. Bishop falls back, and now e5, protecting the d4 pawn. And after takes, pawn takes, long castle. Now you have the advantage of h6 because first you can play the move g5, taking the bishop and knight into c5, capturing the pawn, and black is already better. Bishop g4 is also coming in. That's exactly what happens if queen f3. If queen to g3, you can play the move knight to d7, bishop h6, and now knight to e8, defending the pawn on g7, knight to f3, e5. The point is you cannot capture the pawn because the h6 bishop is hanging up. So rook d1, and now already f5. The idea is to simply roll the pawns in the center, and black is already better. So that's exactly what happens if bishop g5. If white plays knight to f3, you can simply capture the pawn on c4 this time. The point is after queen c4, you are having the move b6. And your idea is to play the move bishop a6, attacking the queen. So after bishop g5, bishop b7, rook c1, attacking the pawn. First play the move h6, where after bishop h4, if white captures the bishop, if white captures the knight, you can play queen f6, queen takes pawn, bishop takes knight, pawn takes, queen takes pawn, and the position is even. That's the reason bishop h4 is the main move, and here you can play the move c5 in the possession, where after dc5 you can play the move knight d7. And the point here is white cannot capture the pawn because after rook c8, white is completely losing. Because if you even try to play a move like queen f4 defending the rook, black can already play queen b6, and white's king is still in the center, and it's already over. So going back, c6 is the main move, where you can play the move rook c8, queen a4, and already queen c7. You cannot capture either of the piece because the rook is hanging. So queen takes pawn, and here knight to e4. The idea is pretty simple. Now you can play the move bishop into pawn, knight c5, and black is extremely better. So that's how you can easily continue this position. So now you have successfully mastered the 20 variations under the Nimzo-Indian Defense. So thank you for watching, and bye bye.